The sound started at 3 in the morning. Not a bang, not a thump. Something worse. Something that made the hair on the back of your neck stand at attention like soldiers awaiting a command they never wanted to receive. It was a scratching. Slow, deliberate. Like fingernails dragging across wood, somewhere deep within the walls of a quiet Massachusetts home. And if you listened closely, if you held your breath and pressed your ear against the plaster, you could almost convince yourself it was something else. The house settling. Mice, maybe. The old pipes groaning against the cold New England winter. But it wasn't any of those things, because the scratching wasn't random. It followed a pattern. It moved. It traveled through the walls like something alive, something patient, something that had been watching and waiting and learning the rhythms of the family that lived there. And here's what makes this story different from every ghost story you've ever heard. The thing in the walls, it wasn't a ghost. It was a 16-year-old boy named Danny LaPlante. And he had been living inside their home for weeks. I want you to think about that for a moment. Really let it sink in. Someone you've never met, someone you've never seen, breathing the same air as you while you sleep, eating your food when you're at work, watching you through cracks in the ceiling, standing in your bedroom doorway at night, just standing there while you dream peacefully of ordinary things. This is not a supernatural horror story. This is something far more terrifying, because this actually happened. Every word I'm about to tell you is documented, investigated, and confirmed. The events took place between 1986 and 1987 in the small towns of Pepperell and Townsend, Massachusetts. And by the time Danny LaPlante's reign of terror finally ended, nothing in these communities would ever feel safe again. Before I continue, I need to ask you something. If this story makes you feel something, if it gets under your skin the way Danny got under those floorboards, I need you to share this video. Not for me, for the people who need to hear this, for the parents who think they know everything happening in their homes, for the young women who need to trust their instincts when something feels wrong. Share this now and make sure you're subscribed, because what I'm about to tell you across these 8 chapters will change how you look at the locked doors in your own house. Let me take you back to Pepperell, Massachusetts. Fall of 1986, a town of roughly 5,000 people, the kind of place where neighbors waved at each other from their driveways and children rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. Crime was something that happened in Boston, an hour away. Here, the biggest concern was whether the high school football team would make playoffs. The Bowen family lived in a modest 2-story colonial on a tree-lined street. Brian Bowen was a widower, still grieving the loss of his wife, still trying to figure out how to raise 2 teenage daughters on his own. Annie and Jessica Bowen were 15 and 16 years old, respectively. Good students. Normal teenagers dealing with the impossible weight of losing their mother while trying to navigate the already treacherous waters of adolescence. The house felt emptier without their mother. That's what everyone would say later. It felt like something was missing from those walls, some essential warmth that had been extinguished. Brian worked long hours to keep his mind occupied, to keep the bills paid, to keep himself from drowning in memories. The girls clung to each other and to their routines, trying to rebuild some sense of normalcy from the wreckage of their grief. It was into this wounded household that Danny LaPlante first appeared. He didn't break in, not at first. He came through the front door, invited by Jessica after they'd met at school. Danny was new to the area, or so he claimed. He was quiet, a little awkward, but there was something about him that made Jessica feel comfortable. Maybe it was the way he listened when she talked about her mother. Maybe it was the fact that he seemed just as lost as she felt, like two ships adrift in the same dark ocean. They went on a few dates, nothing serious, typical teenage activities. But Brian Bowen noticed something off about the boy almost immediately. There was a flatness to Danny's eyes, a quality that Brian couldn't quite name. It was like talking to someone who was performing the role of a normal teenager, rather than actually being one. Every smile seemed calculated, every response just a half-beat delayed, as if Danny was translating from some internal language that decent people didn't speak. Brian told Jessica he didn't want her seeing the boy anymore. Jessica, being 16, pushed back. So they argued. She accused her father of trying to control her, of not trusting her judgment. He accused her of being naive, of not understanding the dangers of the world. In the end, as these arguments often do, it ended with a slammed door and tears, and that special kind of silence that falls over a house when love and fear collide. Jessica stopped seeing Danny, or so Brian believed. The truth was more complicated. Jessica had noticed things too. The way Danny talked about other girls at school, a possessiveness in his voice that made her uncomfortable. The way he'd show up at places she hadn't told him she'd be. The way he'd ask questions about her family, about the layout of her house, about her father's work schedule, questions that seemed innocent enough on their own, but together painted the portrait of something darker. She ended things with him, told him she wasn't interested anymore. Danny's reaction should have been the first real warning sign. He didn't yell, he didn't cry. He simply stared at her with those flat, empty eyes and said, "You'll change your mind." Not, "I hope you change your mind." Not, "Can we talk about this?" "You will change your mind." Like it was already decided. Like he knew something she didn't. The scratching started 3 days later. At first, Brian dismissed it. Old houses made noises. The plumbing in these colonial-era buildings was notoriously unreliable. But the girls heard it too, and Annie, the younger one, started having trouble sleeping. She told her father that it sounded like someone walking above her room. Brian checked the attic himself, found nothing, and assured his daughter that her imagination was playing tricks on her. The noises continued, escalated. The scratching became tapping. The tapping became footsteps. And then came the voices, whispers, just at the edge of hearing, coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from everywhere and nowhere at once. Words that couldn't quite be made out, but the tone was unmistakable. It was mocking, it was watching, it was enjoying their fear. Annie became convinced the house was haunted. The ghost of their mother, she theorized, trying to communicate from beyond the grave. Jessica wasn't so sure. The activity didn't feel maternal. It felt predatory. But she kept that thought to herself, not wanting to frighten her sister any further. Brian hired someone to check the house for animals. Nothing. He had an electrician examine the wiring. Everything was fine. He even called a plumber to inspect the pipes, grasping at any rational explanation that would make the nightmare stop. And then, on a night that would become the stuff of local legend, Annie woke up to use the bathroom and saw someone standing in the hallway. A figure dressed entirely in white, a face that looked wrong, painted with something dark and angular like war paint or ritual markings. And in the dim light of the hallway, she could see that the figure was smiling. Annie screamed. She screamed so loud that windows rattled and neighbors later reported hearing it from 3 houses away. Jessica came running. Brian came running with a baseball bat. But by the time they reached Annie, the figure was gone, vanished, like it had never been there at all. They searched every room, every closet, every corner of that house. They found nothing, no sign of entry, no evidence that anyone had been there. Brian called the police, who responded quickly but found the same thing, nothing. The officers were sympathetic but skeptical. Teenage girls in a house full of grief, their imaginations working overtime. It happened all the time. They recommended counseling, suggested that the family might benefit from talking to someone about their loss. They left their card and told Brian to call if anything else happened. Something else was about to happen. Something that would prove Annie's ghost was terrifyingly real and terrifyingly human. The days following Annie's sighting were torture for the Bowen family. I want you to understand what psychological warfare looks like when it's waged inside your own home. It's not the big moments that break you. It's the small ones. It's reaching for a coffee mug and finding it moved 3 inches from where you left it. It's noticing that the family photos on the mantle have been rearranged. It's the feeling, constant and inescapable, that you are never truly alone. Brian Bowen began sleeping with a baseball bat beside his bed. He installed new locks on all the doors. He checked every window before going to sleep and checked them again when he woke up. None of it helped, because the threat wasn't coming from outside. It was already inside. Annie refused to sleep alone anymore. She moved into Jessica's room, the 2 sisters sharing a bed like they had when they were children, when thunderstorms felt like the scariest thing the world had to offer. They created signals between them, ways to communicate if they heard something, if they needed to wake their father without making noise. Jessica noticed something that she didn't tell anyone. Not at first. The activity seemed focused on her. The whispers were loudest outside her bedroom door. Items from her room went missing, only to appear days later in strange places. And sometimes, late at night, she could swear she heard breathing. Not her own, not Annie's. Something else. Something that was waiting. The ghost appeared again on a Wednesday night. This time it was Jessica who saw it. She had gotten up to get a glass of water, trying to be quiet so she wouldn't wake Annie. She made it to the kitchen, filled her glass, and turned around to find the figure standing in the doorway. Same white clothing, same dark painted face, same terrible smile. But this time, Jessica saw something else. Eyes that she recognized. Eyes she had looked into on dates in school hallways, in the moments before she told their owner she didn't want to see him anymore. "Danny," she whispered. The figure tilted its head almost playfully and then disappeared into the darkness of the house. Jessica didn't scream. She stood frozen in that kitchen, water glass trembling in her hand, as the impossible became unavoidably real. The ghost wasn't a ghost. The haunting wasn't supernatural. It was Danny LaPlante, and he had found a way into their home. She woke her father and told him everything. Brian called the police immediately, and this time the officers took it seriously. A teenage boy stalking a family. This was criminal behavior, something they could act on. They launched a full search of the house, starting with the obvious hiding places and moving to the less obvious ones. What they found would make headlines across Massachusetts. Behind a wall in the basement, there was a crawl space that led to a network of passages throughout the house. Danny LaPlante had discovered this architectural quirk and exploited it perfectly. He had created a nest in the spaces between walls, in the gap beneath the attic insulation, in the forgotten corners of a house that the Bowen family thought they knew completely. Evidence of his occupation was everywhere. Food wrappers and empty containers, stolen from the Bowen kitchen when the family wasn't home. A sleeping bag, weathered and dirty from weeks of use. Flashlights. A notebook filled with observations about the family's routines, their schedules, their habits, and photographs. Polaroids of the Bowen daughters, taken without their knowledge, images of them sleeping, eating, studying, existing without any idea that a predator was documenting their every move. Danny wasn't there when they found his hiding place. He had fled some time after Jessica spotted him, disappearing into the night like the ghost he had pretended to be. But now the police knew who they were looking for. The manhunt began immediately. Danny LaPlante was 16 years old, but he was smart enough to evade capture for nearly 2 weeks. He had resources the police didn't expect. He knew the area intimately, and he had a capacity for patience that bordered on supernatural. While officers searched the obvious places, Danny moved through the shadows of Pepperell and the surrounding towns, waiting for the attention to die down, waiting for his moment. During this time, Brian Bowen moved his family out of their home. They stayed with relatives, the girls missing school, their lives put on indefinite pause. Every knock on the door made them flinch. Every stranger's face in a crowd seemed to morph into Danny's features. The haunting had ended, but the fear it created was permanent. I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever felt truly unsafe in a place that was supposed to protect you? Not scared of something outside, but terrified of what might already be inside? Think about that for a moment, and when you're done, leave a comment telling me about a time when your instincts told you something was wrong before your mind caught up. I read every single comment, and your story might help someone else trust their own gut feeling. Danny LaPlante was eventually captured on December 1st, 1986. He was found hiding in another home, another space between walls, another family's worst nightmare becoming briefly real. The arrest was without incident. Danny offered no resistance, no explanation, no remorse. He was charged with breaking and entering, criminal stalking, and making threats. Given his age, the legal system treated him as a juvenile. This was perhaps the greatest mistake in the entire terrible story. In Massachusetts juvenile court, Danny LaPlante was sentenced to time in a juvenile facility, where he would remain until he turned 18. The theory was that he could be rehabilitated, that whatever darkness had driven him to terrorize the Bowen family could be addressed through therapy, through structure, through the gentle correction that the juvenile system was designed to provide. The Bowen family tried to rebuild their lives. They sold the house in Pepperell, unable to live in a home that had become a crime scene. They moved to a new town, a fresh start, a place where the walls didn't whisper and the shadows didn't move. Annie and Jessica finished high school, went on to college, tried to forget the months when a monster had lived among them. But Danny LaPlante didn't forget. He spent his time in juvenile detention the same way he had spent his time in the Bowen walls, watching, waiting, learning. The counselors who worked with him noted his intelligence, his ability to tell them exactly what they wanted to hear. He made progress, they said. He showed remorse. He was ready to rejoin society. On his 18th birthday, Danny LaPlante was released. He walked out of that facility with the same flat eyes, the same calculating mind, and a rage that had been fermenting for 2 years. The system had called him rehabilitated. The system was catastrophically wrong. What happened next would transform Danny LaPlante from a local nuisance into a name that would haunt Massachusetts forever. The stalking of the Bowen family was just the beginning. It was the practice run, the warm-up act. The main event was still to come, and it would be written in blood. Townsend, Massachusetts sits about 10 miles north of Pepperell. In 1987, it was an even smaller community, barely 3,000 people, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were nearly impossible to keep. The town center had a general store, a post office, and a white steepled church that had stood since the Revolutionary War. It was the kind of place that represented everything good about small-town America. It was the kind of place that never expected a monster. The Gustafson family had lived in Townsend for generations. Andrew Gustafson had grown up there, married there, built his business there. He owned a successful plumbing company that served the whole region. His wife Priscilla was a nurse at a nearby hospital, respected throughout the community for her kindness and dedication. Together they had built the life that everyone dreams about. A beautiful home on Main Street, financial stability, 2 young children named William and Abigail. William was 7 years old in 1987. Abigail was 5. They were the center of their parents' world, the reason Andrew and Priscilla worked so hard, the faces that made every sacrifice worthwhile. Pictures of the children covered every surface of the Gustafson home. Their artwork adorned the refrigerator. Their laughter filled every room. But there was a shadow over this picture-perfect family, one that most people in Townsend didn't know about. Andrew and Priscilla's marriage was complicated, as many marriages are. There had been separations, reconciliations, the difficult work of 2 people trying to figure out how to love each other through the challenges that life throws at everyone. In late 1987, Andrew had moved out temporarily. He and Priscilla were taking space, trying to decide what their future looked like. It was painful, but it was also private. The kind of thing couples worked through behind closed doors. Priscilla stayed in the family home with William and Abigail. She continued working her shifts at the hospital, continued maintaining the house, continued being the mother her children needed her to be. Friends described her as hopeful during this time. She believed she and Andrew would work things out. She believed in the life they had built together. She didn't know that someone was watching. Danny LaPlante had been out of juvenile detention for several months. He had returned to the Pepperell area, living with relatives who had been convinced by the system that he was a changed young man. He kept a low profile, avoided the Bowen family, stayed out of trouble in any way that could be documented. But inside, nothing had changed. The darkness that had driven him into the walls of the Bowen home hadn't been treated. It had been caged. And now it was loose, hungry, looking for new prey. How Danny first spotted Priscilla Gustafson remains unclear to this day. Perhaps he saw her at the grocery store, noticed the wedding ring, the harried expression of a woman managing too much on her own. Perhaps he followed her home, watched her routine, cataloged her vulnerabilities the way he had cataloged the Bowens. Whatever the method, by late December 1987, Danny LaPlante had found his next target. The Gustafson home was different from the Bowen house. More modern construction, fewer hidden spaces, better security. Danny couldn't simply move into the walls and wait. He would need a different approach. So he began with the phone calls. They started the week before Christmas. Heavy breathing on the line. Long silences that seemed to stretch into infinity. Priscilla hung up the first few times, assuming it was a prank, some bored teenager with nothing better to do. But the calls kept coming. And then they changed. A whispered voice, barely audible, saying her name. Priscilla. Just that. Just her name. Spoken like a secret, like a promise, like a threat. She told her friends she was being harassed. They advised her to contact the police, which she did. The officers took a report, suggested she change her phone number, promised to increase patrols in the area. Standard procedure for nuisance calls. Nothing to be too worried about. Priscilla was worried anyway. She was a nurse. She had seen what people were capable of, the violence that humans could inflict upon each other. Her instincts were sharper than most, honed by years of emergency room experience. Something about these calls felt different, felt dangerous, felt like a countdown to something terrible. She considered moving in with her parents, taking the children somewhere else until Andrew came back. But it was almost Christmas. The children had their routines, their expectations, the magic of the season that she didn't want to disrupt. She decided to wait it out. Just a few more days, and then they could reassess. December 20th, 1987, a Sunday. Priscilla Gustafson worked a day shift at the hospital, leaving William and Abigail with a babysitter. Her shift was uneventful, the usual mix of minor emergencies and paperwork that defined hospital work. She called home during her lunch break to check on the children. Everything was fine. William was watching television. Abigail was napping. The babysitter reported nothing unusual. Priscilla finished her shift at 4 in the afternoon. She drove home through the gathering December darkness, looking forward to dinner with her children, to the simple pleasures that made the hard work worthwhile. As she pulled into her driveway, she noticed that the house looked darker than usual. Not all the lights were on. Maybe the babysitter had let the kids fall asleep again. Maybe they were in the back of the house, where the windows faced the yard instead of the street. She got out of her car, walked to the front door, and found it unlocked. This was unusual. The babysitter knew to keep the doors locked. Priscilla had been very clear about that, especially given the phone calls. A small knot of worry formed in her stomach as she pushed the door open and stepped inside. Hello? The house was quiet. Too quiet. No television sounds, no children's voices, no response from the babysitter. Jennifer, kids? Priscilla moved through the entryway into the living room. The Christmas tree stood in the corner, lights twinkling, presents arranged beneath it. Everything looked normal, everything looked fine. But something was wrong. She could feel it. That instinct she'd developed after years of nursing. The ability to sense when a patient was declining before the monitors caught up. The house felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate. She found the babysitter first. Jennifer was 17 years old, a neighbor's daughter, who had been watching the Gustafson children for years. She was lying on the kitchen floor, unconscious but breathing, a wound on her head, suggesting she had been struck from behind. Priscilla's training kicked in immediately. She checked Jennifer's vitals, confirmed she was stable, and reached for the phone to call for help. The line was dead. Cut, she realized. Someone had cut the phone line. Priscilla ran for the back door, intending to get to a neighbor's house, to call for help, and to find her children. The back door was locked from the outside. She ran to the front door, also locked. Somehow, in the moments since she'd entered, someone had sealed the house. She was trapped. And somewhere in that house, so were her children. "William! Abigail!" Her voice echoed through the empty rooms. No response. She began searching room by room, growing more frantic with each space that turned up empty. The children's bedrooms, the bathroom, the basement, every closet, every corner, every hiding place she could think of. Nothing. And then she heard it. A voice. Coming from somewhere above her. The attic. Looking for something, Priscilla. She recognized that voice. Not specifically, not personally, but she recognized its type. The voice of someone who had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The voice of someone who had already decided how this story would end. Danny LaPlante had been waiting for her. He had been in the house for hours, since before the babysitter arrived. He had hidden himself with the patience that defined him, waited for the moment when Priscilla would be alone, when the children would be vulnerable, when all the pieces were arranged exactly as he wanted them. What happened next in that house on Main Street in Townsend, Massachusetts, would become one of the most horrific crimes in the state's history. It would lead to changes in how the juvenile justice system handled dangerous offenders. It would traumatize a community and destroy a family. But before I tell you about the darkness, I need to tell you about the light. Because in every horror story, there has to be hope. There has to be someone who survives. I'm going to be careful with how I describe what happened that night in Townsend. Not because the truth doesn't deserve to be told, but because some details serve no purpose except to feed the kind of curiosity that makes monsters like Danny LaPlante possible in the first place. What I will tell you is enough to understand the magnitude of what occurred, to feel the weight of the lives that were lost, and to comprehend how this case became a turning point in how America thought about juvenile criminals. Priscilla Gustafson was a mother, and in those final moments of her life, she fought like one. The forensic evidence would later show that she didn't surrender. She didn't beg. She didn't freeze. When Danny LaPlante emerged from his hiding place in the Gustafson home, Priscilla attacked him with everything she had. She scratched him deeply enough to leave his DNA under her fingernails. She bit him hard enough to break skin. She threw whatever she could find, fought her way through the house, trying desperately to reach her children, to get them out, to save them even if she couldn't save herself. But Danny LaPlante had a gun. He had stolen it earlier that day, along with the ammunition he would use. He was methodical about it, the same way he had been methodical about learning the Bowen family's routines. The same way he had been methodical about living in their walls. Danny LaPlante didn't act on impulse. He planned. He prepared. He made sure that when he finally made his move, the odds would be overwhelmingly in his favor. Priscilla was shot multiple times. The final shot came as she lay on the floor of her own home, looking up at the face of a stranger who had decided that her life and the lives of her children meant nothing. William was 7. Abigail was 5. They were found in the basement where Danny had taken them before Priscilla came home. They were not shot. The medical examiner determined that they had been drowned. Their bodies were found in the bathtub together, as if they had been trying to hold on to each other at the end. I'm not going to describe more than that. What I will tell you is that Jennifer, the babysitter, survived. She regained consciousness sometime after Danny fled the scene, managed to break a window, and screamed for help until neighbors came running. She was the one who called the police. She was the one who had to watch as officers entered that house and discovered what no human being should ever have to discover. Jennifer blamed herself for years afterward. She wondered if she could have done something differently, if she could have fought harder, if she could have somehow prevented what happened. These are the questions that survivors ask, the wounds that never fully heal, the guilt that becomes a second skin. But Jennifer has to know, and I hope she hears this somehow, that she is not responsible for Danny LaPlante's choices. The only person responsible for that night is Danny LaPlante. He made the decisions. He pulled the trigger. He held those children under the water. No one else? Just him. The investigation moved quickly. Jennifer was able to describe her attacker, and her description matched the boy who had terrorized the Bowen family the year before. Danny LaPlante was identified within hours. The manhunt that followed was the largest in Massachusetts history up to that point. Danny ran, but he didn't run far. He was found 3 days later, hiding in the woods near the Townsend town line, cold and exhausted and completely without remorse. When officers approached him, he didn't resist. He didn't apologize. He simply looked at them with those same flat eyes and asked if he could have something to eat. The news spread through Massachusetts like wildfire. This wasn't just a murder. This was the murder of a mother and her 2 young children by someone the justice system had already caught and released. The questions came fast and furious. How had Danny LaPlante been allowed back on the streets? Why hadn't his stalking of the Bowen family resulted in more serious consequences? What had the juvenile system done or failed to do that allowed this monster to evolve into a killer? These were uncomfortable questions because they didn't have easy answers. Danny LaPlante had been a juvenile when he committed his first crimes. The system was designed to believe in rehabilitation, to give young people second chances, to avoid branding children as permanent criminals. These were noble impulses. In most cases, they worked. But Danny LaPlante wasn't most cases. And the experts who examined him after his arrest painted a disturbing picture. Danny showed all the hallmarks of what psychologists call antisocial personality disorder, combined with a specific type of predatory behavior that was rare even among violent criminals. He didn't feel empathy. He didn't feel remorse. He understood intellectually that other people were human beings with their own lives and desires, but he didn't care. They were objects to him, props in a drama that revolved entirely around his own needs. The counselors in the juvenile facility had missed this, or rather, they had been fooled by it. Danny was intelligent enough to perform normalcy. He could say the right words, make the right facial expressions, convince well-meaning therapists that he was making progress. But it was all theater. behind the mask, nothing changed. Andrew Gustafson had to identify his wife's body and then his children's bodies. I can't imagine that moment. I don't want to imagine it. The life he had been trying to save through his separation, the family he hoped to return to, was gone. Erased by a stranger who had chosen them for reasons that would never make sense. Andrew Gustafson became a different man after that night. Everyone who knew him said so. The light went out of his eyes. He moved through the world like a ghost, haunted by what he had lost, tortured by the knowledge that he hadn't been there when his family needed him most. He would testify at Danny LaPlante's trial. He would look into the eyes of the young man who had destroyed everything he loved, and he would find nothing there. No humanity, no regret. Just the flat, empty stare of a predator who had finally been caged. The trial was scheduled for 1988. Danny LaPlante would be tried as an adult, charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The prosecution intended to seek the death penalty, but Massachusetts had abolished capital punishment years earlier. The best they could hope for was life in prison without parole. It would have to be enough. But before the trial could begin, there was another story that needed to be told, the story of the investigation, the story of how Danny was caught, how the evidence was gathered, how the police built a case that would become one of the most closely watched trials in Massachusetts history. And it's in that story that we find the first seeds of justice. Detective Michael Sorrow had been with the Massachusetts State Police for 15 years when he got the call about the Gustafson murders. He was experienced, hardened by years of seeing humanity at its worst. But nothing had prepared him for what he would find in that house on Main Street. I spoke with officers who worked that case, and they all said the same thing. You don't forget a scene like that. You can process it, you can do your job, you can bring the perpetrator to justice. But the images stay with you. They become permanent residents in a part of your mind that you can't evict them from. Detective Sorrow was determined to build an airtight case. He knew who the suspect was almost immediately, thanks to Jennifer's description and the clear connection to the Bowen stalking case. But knowing and proving are different things. He needed evidence, physical evidence, the kind that would leave no room for doubt in a jury's mind. The crime scene was processed with extraordinary care. Every fingerprint, every fiber, every drop of blood was cataloged and preserved. Danny had been careful, but he hadn't been careful enough. His fingerprints were found on surfaces throughout the house. Hair samples matched his known profile, and the scratches on his body observed when he was arrested were consistent with defensive wounds from Priscilla's fingernails. The gun was recovered from the woods where Danny had been hiding. Ballistic analysis confirmed it was the weapon used in the shooting. The gun's registered owner reported it stolen from his home earlier that week, and neighbors placed Danny in the area on the day of the theft. But perhaps the most damning evidence was found in Danny's hiding spot near Townsend. He had kept a journal. In it, he had documented his surveillance of the Gustafson family. Pages and pages of observations about Priscilla's schedule, about the children's routines, about Andrew's absence. He had drawn maps of the house, noting entry and exit points. He had written about his fantasies, the things he planned to do once he had the family under his control. The journal made it clear that this was not a crime of opportunity. Danny LaPlante had spent weeks planning what he would do to the Gustafsons. He had chosen them specifically, though his reasons remained murky. Perhaps it was because Priscilla reminded him of someone. Perhaps it was because the family represented something he hated, some version of normalcy and happiness that he wanted to destroy. Perhaps there was no reason at all, just the random cruelty of a broken mind selecting its next victims. Prosecutors used the journal to establish premeditation. First-degree murder requires proof that the killer planned the crime in advance, that it wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. Danny's meticulous notes made that argument easy. The defense faced an impossible task. Danny's court-appointed lawyers considered various strategies. They could argue insanity, but Danny clearly understood the difference between right and wrong. He had planned the crimes, evaded detection, fled from police. These were not the actions of someone disconnected from reality. They were the actions of someone who understood consequences and tried to avoid them. They could argue diminished capacity, suggesting that Danny's mental issues made him less culpable for his actions. But the brutality of the crimes, especially what had been done to the children, made this strategy dangerous. A jury that heard those details would be unlikely to grant any measure of sympathy. In the end, the defense settled on the weakest possible argument. They would try to create doubt about the physical evidence, suggest that Danny might have been framed, argue that the police had rushed to judgment because of his past record. It didn't work. The trial began in the spring of 1988 and lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution presented its evidence methodically, building a case that left no room for alternative explanations. Witness after witness took the stand. Jennifer testified about the attack, her voice shaking but determined. Forensic experts explained the physical evidence. Detectives walked the jury through the investigation step by step. Andrew Gustafson testified on the second day. He described his wife, his children, the life they had built together. He talked about William's love of dinosaurs, about Abigail's infectious laugh, about Priscilla's dedication to her patients and her family. He humanized the victims, made them real to the jury, made their loss tangible in a way that evidence alone could never accomplish. When he was asked to identify photographs of the crime scene, Andrew broke down. The courtroom fell silent except for his sobs, a sound that would stay with everyone who heard it for the rest of their lives. Danny LaPlante sat through the trial with the same flat expression he always wore. He didn't react when the evidence was presented. He didn't flinch when the photographs were shown. He watched the proceedings like a spectator at someone else's trial, curious but emotionally uninvested. His behavior disgusted the jury. Later interviews revealed that several jurors had formed their opinion of Danny's guilt within the first few days, based largely on his complete lack of emotional response to what he had done. The deliberations lasted less than 4 hours. On May 15, 1988, Danny LaPlante was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. The sentencing phase followed immediately. Because Massachusetts didn't have the death penalty, the judge had limited options. But within those options, he chose the maximum punishment available. Danny LaPlante was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He would die in prison. He would never walk free again. The state had done everything in its power to ensure that he would never have the opportunity to hurt anyone else. After the sentencing, Andrew Gustafson made a statement to the press. "No sentence can bring back my wife and children," he said. "No prison term can undo what was done to them. But I take some comfort in knowing that this individual will never have the chance to do this to another family. That's the only justice that matters now." The case had enormous implications beyond the immediate verdict. Massachusetts legislators, horrified by what had happened, began reviewing the juvenile justice system that had released Danny LaPlante after the Bowen stalking case. New laws were proposed, new procedures were implemented. The idea that all juveniles could be rehabilitated was challenged and modified. These changes came too late for the Gustafson family, but they may have saved others. In the years following Danny LaPlante's conviction, more attention was paid to young offenders who showed signs of predatory behavior. More resources were devoted to identifying the small percentage of juveniles who posed a genuine danger to society. Danny LaPlante became a case study in criminal psychology, an example of what happens when the system fails to recognize a true predator. Textbooks were written about him. Documentaries were filmed. His name became synonymous with a certain type of evil, the kind that wears a human face, but lacks any trace of human conscience. But there's another part of this story that doesn't get told as often. The part about the survivors. The part about the people who had to rebuild their lives after Danny LaPlante tore through them like a tornado through a trailer park. Because survival isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning of a different one. I want to talk about what happens after the trial ends and the cameras go away, after the news cycle moves on to the next tragedy, after the courtroom empties and the verdict becomes just another line in a legal database. What happens to the people who were left behind? The Bowen family, the first victims of Danny LaPlante's predation, had to learn how to live with what had happened to them. Annie and Jessica Bowen were teenagers when a boy lived in their walls. When they woke up to find a painted face watching them in the darkness, they were still teenagers when they learned that same boy had murdered a mother and her 2 young children. The connection to the Gustafson case affected them deeply. Both women, in later interviews, talked about the guilt they carried. If only they had pushed harder for Danny to receive serious consequences. If only the system had listened when their father warned them about the danger. If only, if only, if only. But if only is a prison of its own, and the Bowen sisters eventually found their way out of it. They went to college. They built careers. They had families. They lived their lives not in spite of what had happened to them, but in acknowledgement of it. They became advocates for stalking victims, sharing their story to help others recognize the warning signs they had missed. Jessica Bowen, in particular, became a powerful voice for change. She testified before legislative committees, pushing for stronger stalking laws and better coordination between law enforcement agencies. She spoke at conferences and universities, teaching young women to trust their instincts when something felt wrong. Danny LaPlante taught me that monsters are real, she said in one interview. But he also taught me that monsters can be stopped. You just have to believe yourself when you see one. Jennifer, the babysitter, faced the longest road to recovery. She had been in the house when the Gustafson children were taken. She had been unconscious while terrible things happened, just feet away from her. The survivor's guilt she carried was immense. even though she bore no responsibility for what Danny had done. For years, Jennifer struggled. She had nightmares that made sleep dangerous. She had flashbacks that made ordinary activities impossible. She went through therapy, through medication, through every treatment that might help her find some peace. And eventually she found it, not by forgetting what happened, but by transforming it. Jennifer became a crisis counselor, working with victims of violent crime. She used her experience to connect with people who had survived the unsurvivable, who were struggling to find meaning in the aftermath of tragedy. I used to think surviving was a curse, she told me. Now I understand it was a responsibility. I survived, so I could help others survive too. Andrew Gustafson's journey was the hardest. He had lost everything. His wife, his children, his belief in the fundamental safety of the world. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, friends worried that Andrew might take his own life. The darkness that consumed him was profound, absolute, a grief so heavy that it seemed impossible to carry. But Andrew carried it. He carried it through the trial, where he had to sit in the same room as his family's killer. He carried it through the media frenzy, where strangers offered opinions about his marriage, his choices, his grief. He carried it through the anniversaries that came every year, dates circled in blood on the calendar of his memory. Andrew Gustafson remarried eventually. He had more children. He rebuilt something that resembled a life. But he never forgot. How could he? William and Abigail were with him every day in the moments between heartbeats, in the spaces between breaths. He established a foundation in their names. The Gustafson Family Foundation provides support services to families affected by violent crime. It funds counseling, legal assistance, and practical help for people who are suddenly thrown into the worst chapter of their lives. I can't bring my family back, Andrew said at the foundation's launch, but I can make sure their deaths mean something. I can make sure other families don't have to face this alone. These are the stories that don't make headlines, the slow, painful work of recovery, the daily choice to keep living when everything has been taken from you, the transformation of grief into purpose, of victimhood into advocacy. Danny LaPlante tried to destroy these people. He failed. They survived him. And more than that, they transcended him. They took the darkness he inflicted and turned it into light for others. That's not weakness. That's power. The kind of power that Danny LaPlante will never understand. Locked in his cell, surrounded by concrete and steel, and the empty hours of a life with no purpose. I believe in the resilience of human beings. I believe that even the most terrible wounds can heal given enough time and enough care. I believe that Danny LaPlante's victims refused to let him win, and in that refusal they achieved a victory more meaningful than any prison sentence. But there's one more chapter in this story, the chapter about Danny LaPlante himself, about what happened to him after the verdict, about where he is now and what his existence means. Because even monsters have endings. Danny LaPlante has been incarcerated for more than 35 years now. He spent his adult life in the maximum security wing of MCI Cedar Junction, formerly known as Walpole State Prison. It's one of the oldest and most notorious prisons in Massachusetts, home to the state's most dangerous criminals. Danny LaPlante fits right in. For the first several years of his incarceration, Danny was a problem. He got into fights with other inmates. He threatened guards. He refused to participate in any rehabilitative programs, mocking the counselors who tried to reach whatever might remain of his humanity. Prison officials quickly learned that Danny LaPlante was not going to change. He was not going to have a revelation about the horror of his crimes. He was not going to become a model prisoner seeking redemption. He was simply going to exist, a permanent resident of the Massachusetts correction system, maintained at public expense until the day he died. There were attempted escapes, though none came close to success. Danny's intelligence, the same trait that had allowed him to live in the Bowen family's walls and plan the Gustafson murders, was now applied to mapping the prison, identifying weaknesses, planning exits that never materialized. The guards knew what he was doing. They watched him constantly, adding layers of security specifically designed for him. Over time, Danny settled into the routine of incarceration. The fights became less frequent. The escape attempts stopped. He was growing older, his body beginning to fail him the way all bodies eventually do. But the flatness in his eyes never changed. Visitors to the prison, mostly journalists seeking interviews for books and documentaries, reported the same thing. Danny LaPlante would sit across the table from them, answer their questions in a calm, even voice, and show absolutely no emotion about the lives he had destroyed. When asked about the Gustafson children, Danny would sometimes smile. "They were just in the wrong place at the wrong time," he said in one interview. "It happens." That smile is the thing that haunts the people who met him. Not a smirk or a grin, but a genuine smile, as if remembering a pleasant afternoon rather than the murder of a 7-year-old and 5-year-old. Danny LaPlante will never be released. He will never walk free. He will never have the opportunity to do to another family what he did to the Gustafsons. The system that failed once has ensured that it will not fail again. But his existence raises questions that don't have easy answers. What do we do with people like Danny LaPlante? People who are born without the fundamental capacity for empathy that makes human society possible. People who see other human beings as objects to be used and discarded. Some argue that people like Danny should be executed, that society has no obligation to maintain at enormous expense individuals who will never contribute anything and who pose a permanent threat. That death is the only appropriate response to crimes as terrible as his. Others argue that execution would make us too much like Danny, that the state should not be in the business of killing, regardless of how monstrous the criminal. That life imprisonment is sufficient punishment, and that maintaining Danny's life is a statement about our values, not his worth. I don't have the answer to these questions. I'm not sure anyone does. What I know is that Danny LaPlante is locked in a small cell, surrounded by people who know exactly what he is, and that he will remain there until he stops breathing. The Bowen family had to see his face on the news for decades, every time a journalist decided to revisit the case. The Gustafson tragedy became a true crime staple, analyzed and reanalyzed by podcasters and YouTube creators looking for content. Andrew Gustafson stopped giving interviews years ago. He said everything he needed to say at the trial, and he has no interest in reliving the worst moment of his life for the entertainment of strangers. The survivors made peace with Danny's continued existence, the only way anyone can make peace with something so terrible. They focused on what they could control. They built new lives, helped other victims, created meaning from meaninglessness. Danny LaPlante tried to destroy them. He failed. And that brings us to the final chapter of this story. The chapter about justice, about meaning, about what we can learn from the darkest events in human history. I want to circle back to where we started. The sound of scratching in the walls, the idea that someone might be living in your home without your knowledge, watching you, waiting for the moment when you're most vulnerable. Danny LaPlante's story is terrifying, but it's terrifying for a reason. It reminds us that evil is real, that monsters don't announce themselves, that the person smiling at you might be cataloging your weaknesses, planning your destruction, seeing you as nothing more than an object in their own twisted narrative. But that's not the lesson I want you to take from this story. The lesson is this: the survivors won. Not in the sense that they defeated Danny LaPlante physically, not in the sense that they escaped unscathed. The Gustafson children and their mother are gone, and nothing can bring them back. The trauma inflicted on the Bowen family and on Jennifer and on Andrew Gustafson is permanent. But they won because they refused to let Danny define their lives. They won because they took the horror he inflicted and transformed it into something that would help others. They won because they continued to believe in love, in family, in the fundamental goodness of human connection, even after they had seen the worst of what human beings can do. Danny LaPlante is in a cage. He will die in that cage. He has spent his entire adult life surrounded by concrete and steel, watched constantly, allowed nothing that approaches freedom. His existence is a monument to his own failure, a daily reminder that his attempt at destruction was met with an equal and opposite force of justice. Meanwhile, the survivors built families, raised children, created organizations that help others. They lived full lives, lives touched by tragedy, but not defined by it. They proved that human beings can survive almost anything if they choose to keep going, if they choose to find meaning in the aftermath of chaos. I think about Priscilla Gustafson sometimes, a nurse, a mother, a woman who loved her children more than her own safety. In her final moments, she fought. She didn't give up. She didn't surrender. She clawed and bit and threw everything she had at the monster who had entered her home. She lost that fight, but she won something more important. She showed what courage looks like. She demonstrated that human beings, even in their final moments, can choose to fight for what matters. She gave Jennifer time to survive. She made sure that Danny's DNA was under her fingernails, that the evidence would be there to convict him. Priscilla Gustafson was a hero. William and Abigail were innocent. They were children who deserved long lives full of possibility. They deserved to grow up, to have adventures, to become whoever they were meant to become. Danny LaPlante stole that from them, and there's no forgiveness possible for that theft. But they are remembered. Through their father's foundation, through the changes in law that followed their deaths, through the work done in their names to help other families, they live on in the children whose parents sought help because of the resources Andrew Gustafson created. They live on in the conversations about juvenile justice that their deaths finally forced society to have. Memory is a form of immortality. As long as we remember Priscilla and William and Abigail, they are not entirely gone. And as long as we remember Danny LaPlante, we are reminded of what human beings are capable of, both the darkness and the light. The darkness of his actions and the light of those who survived him. This story began with a sound in the walls. It ends with a truth that I hope stays with you. Evil exists, but so does resilience. Monsters walk among us, but so do heroes. The world contains Danny LaPlantes, but it also contains Priscilla Gustafsons. And in the eternal balance between destruction and creation, between despair and hope, I believe that hope wins. Not because the universe is just, not because good always triumphs, but because human beings choose to make it so. Because we decide every day to build instead of destroy, to love instead of hate, to remember instead of forget. Danny LaPlante is an answer to a question that should never have been asked. The real answer, the one that matters, is everything that happened after him. The survivors who kept surviving, the advocates who changed laws, the families who were helped by the foundation that bears the Gustafson name. That's justice. Not the sentence, though the sentence was necessary. Not the prison, though the prison is appropriate. The real justice is that Danny LaPlante's attempt to spread darkness was met by an overwhelming response of light. And that light continues to this day. If you've made it this far, I have one final request. Remember this story, but don't remember just Danny LaPlante. Remember Priscilla, who fought until the end. Remember William and Abigail, who deserved so much more. Remember Andrew, who lost everything and still found a way to help others. Remember the Bowen sisters, who turned their nightmare into advocacy. Remember Jennifer, who transformed survivor's guilt into a calling. Those are the people who matter. Those are the people whose lives have meaning beyond a crime statistic. Danny LaPlante is a cautionary tale. His survivors are an inspiration. Choose which one you carry with you. And if you found value in this story, if it made you think or feel or reconsider something about the world, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next story. Because there are always more stories, more lessons to be learned, more examples of human beings at their worst and their best. The darkness is real, but so is the light. And the light always, always wins.